on the right is Jacob Lawrence, as well as David Driskell, Gwendolyn Knight, Paul Reed, among many others. Throughout these collaborations, he was continuously making his own prints. The exhibition brings these two parts of Stovall's work together to show how the sheer innovation behind his approach to printmaking. So today I'll be sharing a small selection of these works and discussing some of Stovall's complex methods of making. I'm going to show you how Stovall really expanded the medium of screen printing. I'm interested in how Stovall's approach moved beyond stereotypical assumptions of screen printing as we think of as maybe flat, smooth, even manufactured. Instead, Stovall became known for his vibrant colors, delicate washes of pigment, nimble layering of forms, and experimental textures and surfaces. This is a print from 1971, which shows the stratum of purple and blue pigments that have been applied to the paper in both even fields and more painterly layers of color that seem to kind of cascade as they reach to the edge of the paper. I just want to quickly note that whenever possible, you're going to see me showing the overall image and a detail of the work. And I do this because if we were in the gallery, of course, we would be moving back and forth and getting all the details of the prints. And so in offering a detail, I'm hoping that brings us kind of closer to what's really going on in these works. And the detail I'm showing you here really, I think, gives a better sense of the textures that Stovall was developing in this work. So for the exhibition at the Krieger, I am focusing on Stovall's working methods to really help our visitors better understand the innovative nature behind his printmaking. And in the catalog that we produced for the exhibition, there is an essay by me, which has some of the content you'll hear today that follows the history of his work, but then also there is a dialogue between Lou and a former studio assistant, Ann C. Smith, talking about really the technical nature of his work, how he kind of found all these innovative approaches. And so if some of these details interest you, I would encourage you to find our catalog to learn more. So a close look at Stovall's work also allows me to open up an important dialogue about the role of screen printing in American art history. We think of artists such as Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, Roy Lichtenstein, Ed Ruscha as kind of important key figures in the rise of screen printing in the 60s and 70s, but this narrative rarely acknowledges the contributions of artists of color, including Elizabeth Catlett, Romare Bearden, Rupert Garcia, and William T. Williams, among many others. And I just want to note that the Catlett print that I first showed on this slide was created at the workshop with Lou. Stovall built his shop to engage with a diversity of artists and to connect with a range of DC communities. In 1973, an article in the Washington Post stated, this is like the best review anyone's ever received, as much as any man and as much as any institution, Lou Stovall and his workshop are responsible for that friendly spirit of sharing and cooperation. Stovall is not just a printer, an artist, and a teacher, he's a catalyst. As such, I position Stovall and his workshop artists as key to this more kind of holistic understanding of the history of screen printing. Like many artists who found screen printing in the 60s, Stovall first discovered the medium in a commercial context. Stovall was born in Athens, Georgia in 1937, but moved to Springfield, Massachusetts at 4 years old. He discovered screen printing at age 15 while working for a grocery store in Springfield that had a silkscreen shop in the basement. And there he started helping out making signs for the store. And he's talked in several contexts about this important aha moment that he had finding the silkscreen shop and discovering how these things were made. He was also interested in the arts at an early age and first attended RISD in Rhode Island on a scholarship in 1957. He actually had to return home quickly to help his family when his father became ill, and it took him about 5 years to return to college. But when he did, in 1962, he chose Howard University instead, since of course at that time, Washington was the center for social and political change. He was greatly impacted by his professors at Howard, including James L. Wells David Driskell, Lois Jones, and especially James A. Porter. And I'm showing you here an image of Stovall among several of his mentors. While at Howard, he was working at a sign shop in Silver Spring, Maryland, where the owner gave him extra supplies to make his own posters. He made signs for civil rights groups, as well as the legendary DC jazz club Bohemian Caverns. And I'm showing you posters from between 1968 and 1970, starting with a Roberta Flack show on the right at Bohemian Caverns, King Lear at Arena Stage in the center, and a poster for a campaign to end the war in Vietnam on the right. 3 years after graduating from Howard, he opened Workshop Inc. and also married Di Bagley the year before, herself a fellow artist who had come to DC to study at the Corcoran. I love this image for so many reasons, but also mostly because you can see her working on her own print at the workshop, and then you see the finished print on the right. They opened the first location of the print shop on M Street in DC, and then moved to the Corcoran Dupont Center in 1969. The Dupont Center was an experimental artist space established by renowned curator Walter Hopps, who was then the Corcoran's director. Hopps put Stovall, then 32 years old, in charge of this 4-story center, which had a wood and metal workshop, classrooms, an exhibition space, and a fully equipped silkscreen studio. And I just want to note that the Phillips Collection will actually be hosting an exhibition this summer on the Dupont Center. For anyone who's interested, I think it should be a really lovely show. So in the first year that Stovall was in that space, he produced approximately 150,000 posters, cards, and fine art prints in 1 year, 150,000. After the Dupont Center closed in 1972, the Stovalls found the permanent home for the workshop within a year, which is a 50-foot-long converted garage behind their house in the Cleveland Park neighborhood of DC, where they still reside today. Artist Sam Gilliam wrote this about the workshop. He said, "The desire of Lou Stovall to open a printing workshop may have been more important than the Washington Color School in painting. The workshop allowed things to happen beyond printmaking." And so these are images I took from an early studio visit, February 2020, which now means a lot more to us than it maybe did then. And it gives a sense of the trajectory of planning the show throughout the pandemic, but also it marks a particular moment because in May of 2020, an enormous tree actually fell in the workshop, and the Stovalls have been rebuilding it ever since, and it's finally finished. I just visited it a few weeks ago. It's a wonderful space, but this is an earlier version of the workshop, and it's kind of in an evolving stage right now. So while running the workshop, Stovall was taking on numerous assistants, educating school groups, working with government and nonprofit organizations to print materials, and creating opportunities for artists in the area. There was an almost utopian quality built into the workshop from its very beginning, which is reflected in many of Stovall's early dreamlike prints. So for instance, the show at the Krieger opens with this work, Little Love, and I'm showing you the work on the right, and then an image of kind of that first wall in the exhibition at the Krieger. Little Love is a small 15-inch tall print from 1971, and you can see the scale of it in that photo. We first looked at the print to the right of it, which is obviously much bigger, but this is this small work that really kind of packs a punch. Stovall made this print while he was still at the Corcoran Dupont Center, and it shows how the artist was building his imagery through complex layers of color, and you can kind of see that in the details, all the different colors that are underneath this work. The image depicts a tree-like form swooping upward, evoking movement, or even the long hair of a figure. In the image, orange hues are layered with expressive dabs and smears, contrasted by this really fine network of lines defining the branch and shaded trunk. And I really think this work offers an important demonstration of his early experimental compositions. So after Little Love, many of the works in the 1970s are quite large in scale. So I'm showing you Spirit from 1971, which now measures more than 3 feet tall. In the work, a central tree shape sprouts a balloon-like top. delineated by pink and blue surfaces that appear more sponged and dripped than pressed and flattened. The trunk, which is detailed with Stovall's signature fine lines, seems to kind of reach up and grasp the top. Stovall recalled that with Spirit, he was teaching himself to make volume and create structure by layering these translucent colors. In these early works, Stovall developed a range of techniques to bring depth and delicacy to his prints. So I'm going to back up for a minute because I'd like to talk about screen printing as a medium. And so bear with me, but I think it's important as we get into some of the ways that Stovall was really expanding the medium and changing it and evolving it to understand kind of what the base level is. So I'm offering you a diagram, which I hope will help some of my remarks make more sense. So screen printing, when used in a conventional sense, has certain fundamental components, starting with a fine mesh fabric stretched over a frame. And so anyone who screen printed a t-shirt or had any experience with this, you'll be familiar with this part of it. The fabric, traditionally silk, but now most often a woven synthetic material, is the foundation, although I should note that Lou has always worked with silk. So for him, the term silk screen and screen print can be interchangeable. The image is created by selectively blocking off areas of the screen through a variety of possible stenciling methods. And then the printer pulls a squeegee across the surface of the screen, forcing the ink through the open areas of the mesh to the paper waiting below. So ink only passes through the areas of the weave that are not blocked by the stencil. The deposited layer of pigment is typically smooth and opaque with well-defined contours. An entire image is created by this meticulous building of pigments applied one at a time. And I'm very happy that in the show, we have this great object that Lou created, what he describes as a color separation sequence. And so this is a booklet that he made to share with school groups that would come to visit the studio, and he would actually often give them the book to take with them as really a teaching tool. And so you have, it's a visual representation of how he would build an image. And so each pair of images shows the layer on its own, and then the image developing as the layers are added one after another. And so you can see how many layers it takes to make this image of a leaf that has such depth and texture. And in the exhibition, so this is the piece in the exhibition, and you can kind of get a sense of the scale of it. And then there's this great photo of Lou and Di in the workshop above it. So the image on the left shows Stovall cutting stencil film in 1968, which is a kind of more traditional way of creating a stencil for screen printing. And this was his earliest method of creating imagery. But by the early 1970s, he was using sponges, brushes, scrapers, even his own hands on the screen, as well as the traditional rubber squeegee to push the ink through the mesh. And that's where you see all of those novel textures. He was also inscribing his fine lines using these specially designed wooden tools to contrast those large fields of color. And he was using opaque and translucent layers of color, or what he calls glazes, in his prints. And this is a work called Glazing from 1972 that is really representative of this method of using these thin washes of pigment while printing. So Lou and I have talked about this work as marking this important change in his approach to stencil making. So remember, you just saw him stencil making using cut film. So this is a work where he starts to move beyond cut stencils. Instead, he develops, and I'm going to get technical here for a second, so bear with me. So moving away from cut stencils, he begins to develop a liquid stencil that could be applied directly onto the screen, allowing for these more painterly impressions. So this liquid stencil was made by dissolving stencil film in a lacquer thinner. And then it could just be brushed or stippled onto the screen by hand. So glazing in particular in making glazing, he first applied that layer of liquid stencil to the screen to kind of clog the mesh. And then he used brushes to dissolve the stencil material and reopen the mesh to create those wispy shapes. And so in doing this, he's able to create shapes that have the appearance of brush strokes because he's actually dissolving the stencil with a paintbrush. And so let's not forget that these are multiples. So these works were made in a multiple series where every work has the same impression. And so you have these painterly shapes and impressions that have to be replicated time after again for each part of the edition. And so by creating a solid stencil that captures that painterly shape, he's able to kind of translate a painterly appearance into screen printing. Okay, I'm moving out of my technical discussion now. Thank you for bearing with me. So the prints that Stovall made after the 1970s reveal both his attention to fine detail and his deep interest in the natural world. And I'm showing you a work called Right from 1989 that was made as a fundraising print for Amnesty International. And so I love this image because it really shows how he's using these fine translucent layers to create texture and depth. But then also on the right, I'm showing you a detail that I took when I was in the gallery that shows you that pigment is actually gold on the feathers of the birds. And so there's all of these interesting fine details that you see, which are just, I think, so remarkable in screen printing as a medium. And then I just want to show you the scale of that work. This is in the gallery in the exhibition. So you have that piece on the right, and then glazing we just talked about right here. We were also able to show some of Lou's wonderful drawings, pencil drawings in the show as well, just to give you a sense of how he approaches fine detail and how he develops these images first in his sketches and then into the prints as well. Also included in the exhibition are these circular prints. These are from 1974 to 1981, and they're almost these kind of keyhole looks into this fantastical natural world. And for Lou, I mean, this interest in the natural world really continues throughout all of his work. And sometimes it's more abstracted than others. And these work, I think, are a nice bridge where you have those kind of rich colors, the abstracted fields of color, but then there really is this homage to a kind of utopian natural world as well. We also have some of his flower studies that he called his portraits that pair those incredibly detailed fine lines with those rich and bright fields of color. And these are works that you really just want to get up close to when you're in the gallery because there's just so many fine details. So these works overall, my hope for these works in the exhibition is that they show you how Stovall applied his visual toolbox over the course of his career. And some of the most recent works by Stovall in the exhibition are his monoprints. This is one of them. These are one-of-a-kind prints that were made by layering colors directly onto the screen. So this print from 2010, for instance, has this glowing speckled halo above this lush field of blues and greens, as if an enormous rising sun. So in making these works, he's using different tools to pour splatter, splotch pigments. He's creating these spontaneous, even sculptural surfaces. These works are very thick when you get up close to them. They really have more of an intensity of a painted surface, or even a sculptural surface. And he described them as a history or record of his movement over the screen, which I love. So the exhibition walks through these developments in Stovall's work as this kind of visual primer to understand how he then applied many of these methods in his collaborations with other artists through the workshop. So I'm interested in the feedback loop that happens between Stovall and his artists that he worked with, and the kind of visual echoes that appear between the prints. So I mentioned Sam Gilliam. So Sam Gilliam has had the most extensive exchange with Stovall. They've together created 21 prints over 5 decades, including these works. Stovall has reflected on his work with Gilliam being defined by what he called the thrill of the unanticipated. The surfaces of Gilliam's prints are restless, with frenetic layered colors and speckled mottled textures evoking related assemblages of painted wood and metal. And what I love especially about the work on the right is that when you see the work in person, it appears as if those lines are brushstrokes. They have the quality and the kind of organic nature of a brushstroke. But yet again, these are screen prints. These were all made using stencils. And so together they created these stencils that captured the essence of a painted surface, a thickly painted surface. Stovall once described screen printing as an interpretive medium, where he can create prints that what he says look like watercolor, look like acrylic painting, look like oil painting. While Stovall's work with Gilliam was more experimental, his other collaborations often started with a specific work in another medium. Curator Ruth Fine writes about this process of translation, where Stovall was turning one artist medium into a form that could only be made in screen print. So I'm showing you David Driskell's, two works by David Driskell. David Driskell's print Dancing Angel from 2002, which is on the right, was created in connection to a 1974 work made with oil paint, fabric, and collage elements on the left, which is currently in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The painted work depicts an angel-like figure constructed with both Christian and African imagery, which includes a collage picture of an IFA mask adhered to the face. So to create the screen print, Stovall meticulously built the image with seemingly limitless layers of opaque and translucent colors with some distinct visual differences. For instance, and so I'm showing you a detail of the 1974 work on the right, on the left, I'm sorry, and then on the right is actually a photo I took of the side of the screen print. So for instance, the collaged half of the head on the left transforms into an image etched in gold pigment on the right, lending this kind of heavenly effect that's unique only to the print. Another great example of this translation is Gwendolyn Knight's The White Dress from 1999. So this screen print depicts a striking portrait of a woman in profile, bisected by fields of deep red. Stovall did not have access to the original painting, so he used Dye's collection of lace to create the stencils for the delicate patterning of the dress. He then layered opaque white pigment using those shapes, which give the woman's garment volume, as if the patterning is embossed on the surface. And so I have the straightforward image on the left, and then on the right, again, it's my image from the side angle of the print. And you can see how he created that patterning of lace and laid it with those opaque colors to create that almost embossed surface on the print, which is really just striking. I've lost my mouse. Here it is. Okay. So Stovall's work with Jacob Lawrence is also represented in the exhibition by 2 of the 15 screen prints that they created together between 1986 and 1997. The prints were adapted from Lawrence's earliest series, The Life of Toussaint Louverture, composed of 41 gouache paintings made in 1937 to 1938. And so I'm showing you 2 of the works from the original series by Lawrence, which was focused on the leader of Haiti's independence from French colonial rule and the 1791 Haitian Revolution to abolish slavery. So one print from the collaboration between Lawrence and Stovall is this print on the right, The Burning, which was again adapted from or translated from the 1938 painting. So the print depicts a vista with cabins aflame in the background and a complex network of grassy forms that consume the composition, as if this verdant tidal wave echoing the revolution. Lawrence, then based in Seattle, worked out many details in this print over the telephone. Stovall wrote about this experience, and I'm sharing the quote with you because I think it's important for us. I want you to follow along with me because it's long, but I think it's really important. So in creating this print, Stovall writes, "In The Burning, we were counting blades of grass over the telephone. In the original, the grass was not dominant, but in the print, the grass is varied complex and active. We would count the blades of grass from left to right, and then break up the shapes according to elements already in the composition. For instance, Jacob said, put the grass stroke from the top row on the left into the middle of the shape on the third level 15 blades over. We were creating meaning, in other words, making an art language that would take us beyond conventional expectations of what was possible in the silkscreen medium. So in the same text, Stovall writes about the value of collaborative work, and I'm going beyond the individual artist or printmaker. And he states, collaboration after mastery is the single most rewarding experience for an artist. I'm going to say that again because it's just a winning quote. Collaboration after mastery is the single most rewarding experience for an artist. So to represent these two sides of Stovall's work and their interconnected nature, the exhibition at the Krieger includes adjoining sections of both the printmaker's own works and the prints by other artists coming out of the workshop. The show traces Stovall's dialogue with his medium. Certain themes remain consistent, including the printmaker's fearless use of color, his radical style of printmaking, and his deep appreciation for collaboration and community-oriented work. His role as a catalyst continues even today, featured here on his porch in 2020 on the right. I hope you all have a chance to come see the show. I also just wanted to let you know there's a second show of Lou's work at the Krieger, curated by Will Stovall. The exhibition looks at Lou's 1974 series of The Land and its connection to poetry. It's really a wonderful show to see as well because it's a focus look at this one series of prints that Lou is developing in 1974, but then it has the related poetry, the related drawings. So it kind of traces the connection between all of these aspects of Lou's work. And so before I wrap up, I just wanted to share one more thing. So I'm bringing in just a couple more images at the end that were not specifically part of my formal remarks, but I wanted to offer them just to give you, again, a sense of the range of works that were coming out of the workshop and all of the different techniques that Lou was developing in order to have these collaborative relationships and find ways to kind of bring artist work to fruition in screen printing. So I'm showing you a work by Paul Reed on the left from 1969, a work by Minnie Clavens from 1973 in the middle, and then a work by Jean Davis from 1984. And here you have three works that have that, what I would call a harder edge color field approach, in that the lines all have to really sing together, right? There can't be overlapping unless it's chosen for the artist. There has to be this very exact approach to using color and using color fields. And then you have this work by Louis Delsart from 2003. And so again, I think of this as the great range of what is possible in Lou's workshop ink. So you have, this is a work that was again translated from a painted piece, translated into screen printing. And you have a work that is built through just endless layers, maybe not endless, but numerous layers of translucent colors to create shading, to create patterning, to create texture and depth. And Lou and I spent a lot of time talking about the woman's face because of just how many layers and how much exact, how excruciating it was to find that kind of is the exact shape and texture. And so in talking about this work in particular, he said that you can probably see in this print more than any other that I was pretty much trying to read the artist's mind and what they would want. I wasn't interpreting from his instructions as much I was from the original painting he had delivered to me. And so what he would do is he would be receiving a work for translation into screen print and would absorb the essence of the work and then would find a way to translate that essence into screen printing. Instead of, again, it being a reproduction or copy, it would be that moment of translation. And I think that's such a great contrast because you really see what is capable in this medium in Lou's hands. Thank you all so much. I'm excited to see what questions you have for me. I think Natalie's going to come back in to help. Oh, good. Okay. Going to help me navigate Q&A.
Here is a question from Harry Cooper. If in the more painterly prints, the ink is moved through the screen with hands, hang on, I lost the chat here. Move through the screen with hands, sponges, etc. Does that mean that each resulting print in an edition will be quite different?
Oh, I see. Okay. Hi, Harry. Yes. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go all the way back to Spirit. Oh, no, that's glazing. So I think this is a great work to look at with this question because it does have this impression of sponging. Actually, maybe I will go to glazing because glazing might be better. But with this work and with glazing, you have these impressions that, again, they look painterly, they look brushed on as if each print would have a kind of different variation. And I think that gets to your question of that there would be variation between the screen prints. So no, there wouldn't be variation, which I think is something that's so remarkable about these prints, especially by the time Lou is using his liquid stenciling. The liquid stenciling is manipulated using the paintbrushes to create those wispy shapes, and then it dries and then it's fixed and it's ready to print. And so as the paper is laid and the squeegee pulled across, that stencil then becomes fixed, even though it has that feeling of being spontaneous and being painterly. One thing he did tell me was that he would often use oil, oils in the liquid stencil to slow the drying time. So that would allow him to be more kind of creative with how he used brushes or how he moved around the liquid stencil. But then once it dried, it was ready to print. And so every impression would have that same kind of spontaneous shape to it.
Barbara, you have a question. I see your hand raised, but we can't give you audio. So can you drop your question in the chat? Or maybe I can. I think I can allow you to talk, Barbara. So let's give this a try. I'm going to try to unmute you now, Barbara. Here we go.
So my question was, is it possible to know on a particular image how many stencils were used?
I mean, it's a great question. Thank you for that. It completely varies. I mean, this is where I would need to call Lou and confirm. I would say that, in a work like the Louis Delsart work that I showed at the end, this is dozens and dozens of stencils. So I think it's, and even in the Driskell piece, I mean, if you're tracing the number of colors used and then the number of opacities used, so that you might see white, but then you look closely and you realize there are 4 layers, 5 layers or more of opaque or translucent white, to again build that texture. So it completely depends on the print and on the image, but I would say double or triple what you think is there, because it really is. I mean, there are layers that you're not seeing that are creating a foundation also for the image itself. And so one thing I will say that we're working on a program, hopefully to be hosted in person, where we're actually going to be able to screen a film showing Lou working on a print in the 80s, and it gives you a sense of how quickly things were having to move through to run a print, to run something through a stencil, how many stencils were being used in a certain print. And so it is kind of wonderful to get a visual of really what that looked like on a more practical level. So stay tuned for news about that program.
And when a print is being made, do they do multiple images of each screen before moving on to the next, or is each print done completely at once?
Again, a great question. So for each stencil is run through entirely. And actually, I'm going to go back to my demonstration book to I think it was that. Oh yeah. So a stencil would be made on the screen, and Lou was using the same screen since the 60s for his standard sizes. And so a stencil would be made, all of the additions would be run through for that stencil. Then the next layer would be made, and they would all be run through. So they're all being made in the same rhythm at the same time.
Claude is wondering, Danielle, if you could talk about how the prints were documented regarding edition, AP, paper size, and names of printing assistants. Very specific.
So I'll work backward. Thank you for that question. So names of printing assistants would take too long to list. Oh, and we have Ann Smith, a former assistant, just left a question. Because one thing I learned about Lou and Di in working on the show was that they just had an open doors policy for most of the history of the workshop, in that they were constantly bringing in students to be apprentices, more formal studio assistants, but then also if a neighbor's son, was looking for something to do in the summer, they would kind of bring them in and teach them the ropes and have them help out. Like they were constantly mentoring young people and emerging artists throughout the entire history of the workshop. And so I think from my experience working on this project, there were several people who weren't even part of the show who I was in touch with, who just happened to mention, oh, I also assisted Lou at some point. I mean, he really did touch so many people in DC at different parts of their life. It's pretty remarkable. So just to say that. And then edition size also varied. So I couldn't give you a specific answer on that. Especially, some prints were made as fundraisers. He again did a print for Amnesty International that I mentioned. He did prints for the Obama campaigns as well in 2008 and 2009. But then fine art prints would have a different edition size. So those would all really vary. And then paper size as well. So you'll notice that there are some standard sizes, but then when we get to, oh wait, if I go this way, even with the circular prints, there's a real size variance, because I think for Lou, in a lot of cases, it was trying to figure out what made sense with the imagery and what really fit well. So, I mean, I know this doesn't give you specific information, but I would say that he was really just constantly pushing what was capable in screen printing. So as much as he could defy expectations or any kind of standardization, he did it. And so if that included stencil making, if that included sizes, if it included the way he worked with artists, the way he approached collaboration, kind of all of it was just so incredibly unique to his approach. Oh, okay, so Ann Smith, thank you, Ann. So Ann Smith, who I mentioned, is in dialogue with Lou in our catalog, and they just have this wonderful conversation where they really talk about how he developed all these techniques and where they came from and why it was important to him and why this idea of expanding screen printing was important to him. So I'll just plug that as that conversation, but also she mentions that a work by Sam Gilliam had around 100 layers of color in it. And she says there used to be a long train of test strips hanging up in the studio. Yeah, showing each color they used to make the print. So again, like, I think you're looking at a print, you might see a couple dozen colors, and you double and triple whatever you're seeing, and that's probably what's going on inside the print. Thank you, Anne, for that.
Any final questions? Going once. Well, on behalf of the Krieger Museum, I want to thank you so much, Danielle, for taking the time to do this. It was excellent as usual. And if folks have not, please swing by the museum to check out these two fabulous exhibitions on Lou Stovall and his work. But otherwise, have a great day, everyone. And thank you again, Danielle.
Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Stay safe.